The explosion shattered the New Mexico dawn like the wrath of God himself, and Obergefreiter Klaus Weber knew in that instant that everything he thought he understood about American cowboys had been catastrophically wrong. The blast wave hit the prisoner of war compound 3 seconds after the flash, rattling the barbed wire fences and sending a tremor through the concrete foundations that Klaus felt in his bones. He pressed his face against the mesh of his barrack window, squinting through the brilliant orange afterglow that painted the desert mountains in shades of apocalypse. Behind him, 47 other German prisoners stirred from their bunks, muttering confused questions in their native tongue. "Was ist das?" someone whispered. Klaus didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry as the Chihuahuan desert sand that surrounded Camp Sierra, because he recognized that particular quality of light, the way it seemed to burn the very air, leaving purple shadows seared into his retinas. He had seen it once before, in a laboratory in Berlin, when Professor Heisenberg had demonstrated nuclear fission with a handful of uranium and a neutron source. But this was something else entirely. This was what Heisenberg had whispered about in fearful tones during those final desperate months of the Reich, the weapon that could end the world. The Americans had built it first. Klaus stepped back from the window, his legs suddenly unsteady. For 2 years, he and his fellow prisoners had watched their captors with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. Cowboys, they called them. These Americans with their casual attitudes, their chewing gum, their ridiculous optimism about everything from baseball scores to the weather. They seemed to approach warfare like a game, lacking the iron discipline and scientific precision that had made the Wehrmacht the most feared fighting force in Europe. How could such people, Klaus had often wondered, hope to match the technological superiority of German engineering? Now he knew the answer, and it terrified him more than any artillery barrage he'd endured on the Russian front. The camp's loudspeaker crackled to life, Colonel Harrison's voice cutting through the morning stillness with characteristic American directness. "All prisoners remain in barracks until further notice. This is not a drill. Repeat, all prisoners remain in barracks." Klaus sank onto his thin mattress, staring at his hands. These same hands had once helped load 88mm shells into the gun that earned him his capture outside of Anzio. He'd been proud of that gun, proud of German technical superiority, certain that American industrial capacity was no match for Prussian precision. The Cowboys might have numbers, but they lacked the intellectual rigor necessary for truly advanced warfare. How laughably, devastatingly wrong he had been. 2 years earlier, July 1943. The train wheezed to a stop in what Klaus Weber was certain had to be the end of the world. Through the cattle car's single-barred window, he glimpsed an endless expanse of brown dirt, scattered scrub brush, and mountains that looked like God had forgotten to finish painting them. The New Mexico desert stretched in all directions, broken only by the occasional dust devil spiraling toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "Welcome to cowboy country," muttered Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner from the opposite corner of the car. The former Panzer commander's voice carried the bitter edge it had developed during the 3-week journey from the processing center in Virginia. "Look at this wasteland. Even the Americans don't want to live here." Klaus pressed closer to the window as American soldiers began unlocking the car doors. The heat that rolled in was unlike anything he'd experienced, even during the Afrika Korps campaigns. Dry and relentless, seeming to suck moisture from his lungs with each breath. But it wasn't the climate that caught his attention. It was the casual way the American guards carried themselves as they formed up outside the train. "Attention! Everybody out! Move, move, move!" shouted a sergeant with a thick Brooklyn accent, but his voice lacked the sharp precision Klaus expected from military commands. The American soldiers looked relaxed. Their uniforms were properly pressed, their weapons clean and ready, but they stood with an easy confidence that seemed almost unprofessional by Wehrmacht standards. One was actually chewing gum, blowing small bubbles while keeping his rifle at the ready. As the German prisoners filed out of the cattle cars, Klaus studied their new captors more carefully. The sergeant wore 3 chevrons on his sleeve and had the weathered look of a career soldier, but he was chatting with his subordinates about baseball scores. A corporal with red hair and freckles was passing around photographs of what appeared to be his girlfriend back home, grinning as his buddies made appreciative comments. "Cowboys," Klaus whispered to himself, unconsciously echoing Steiner's earlier assessment. It wasn't meant as a compliment. The processing took most of the afternoon. The prisoners were herded through a series of stations where American clerks, most of them looking barely old enough to shave, checked their documentation, cataloged their personal effects, and assigned them to barracks. Klaus found himself paired with Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a quiet artillery spotter from Bavaria, who had been captured during the retreat from Sicily. "Camp Sierra," announced the clerk, handling their paperwork, a thin young man whose uniform still showed the creases from the supply depot. "Barracks 12, bunks 23 and 24. You'll get your orientation tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. Any questions?" Klaus almost asked about work assignments, male privileges, and exercise periods, standard concerns for a prisoner of war. But something in the clerk's manner stopped him. The American seemed genuinely interested in whether they had questions, as if their comfort actually mattered to him. It was unsettling. Camp Sierra sprawled across several acres of desert scrubland, surrounded by the regulation double fence topped with concertina wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, but Klaus noticed that the searchlights weren't particularly impressive, and the spacing between towers seemed wider than German security doctrine would recommend. Inside the compound, the barracks were clean but basic. Long wooden buildings with 48 bunks each, communal latrines, and a central mess hall that actually smelled appetizing. "This is temporary," declared Steiner as they settled into their new quarters that evening. The former Hauptmann had appointed himself unofficial leader of their group, a role that came naturally to someone who had commanded a company of Panzer IVs in North Africa. "The war cannot last much longer. German science will produce the wonder weapons that will turn the tide and will be exchanged or liberated within a year." Several of the other prisoners nodded agreement. They'd all heard the rumors before their capture. Secret weapons being developed in underground laboratories, rocket planes that could reach any target on Earth, bombs of unimaginable power that could level entire cities. The Reich scientists are the finest in the world, after all. These Americans might have superior numbers, but they lack the intellectual sophistication necessary for truly advanced warfare. Klaus wanted to believe it, but something about their capture nagged him. The American forces that had overwhelmed his position at Anzio hadn't fought like the disorganized rabble that German propaganda described. Their artillery was precisely coordinated, their infantry well supplied and aggressive, their armor effectively deployed. Most disturbingly of all, they had demonstrated a level of tactical flexibility that suggested genuinely competent leadership. Still, he kept these thoughts to himself as he unpacked his few remaining possessions. His fellow prisoners needed hope, and challenging their beliefs about German superiority would serve no purpose. Besides, what did he really know about American capabilities? He was just an Obergefreiter who had operated an anti-aircraft gun. Strategy and grand tactics were beyond his expertise. The mess hall that night offered their first real glimpse into American military culture, and Klaus found it both fascinating and slightly appalling. The food was actually quite good. Beef stew with vegetables, fresh bread, and coffee that didn't taste like it had been made from acorns. But the American soldiers serving it seemed to take positive pleasure in chatting with their German prisoners, asking about their hometowns, their families, even their military service. "You boys fought in Russia?" asked a cook with sergeant stripes and a pronounced Texas drawl. "That must have been something. Cold as a witch's, well, cold as anything, I bet." Klaus found himself drawn into conversation, despite his better judgment. The sergeant, who introduced himself as Joe Martinez from El Paso, had an infectious enthusiasm for discussing anything and everything, from the relative merits of German and American small arms to his mother's recipe for enchiladas. Within minutes, he was describing his pre-war job at a copper mine and asking Klaus about his studies in electrical engineering. "You worked with radios and such?" Martinez's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "We got some of them German sets in the supply depot. Fancy stuff. Better than most of our equipment, truth be told. You ever work on anything like radar?" Klaus felt a chill despite the desert heat. Radar was classified technology, crucial to air defense. Why was an American mess sergeant asking about it so casually? Was this some form of intelligence gathering? Or was Martinez simply making conversation? "Just a basic radio repair," Klaus answered carefully. "Nothing sophisticated." Martinez nodded and moved on to discussing the upcoming baseball season, seemingly satisfied with the response. But Klaus remained uneasy. Either the Americans were remarkably careless with security, or they were more subtle than he had given them credit for. After dinner, the prisoners were allowed to socialize in the common area, a large room with tables, benches, and even a few American magazines. Klaus settled into a corner with Mueller and a few others, watching their captors with growing bewilderment. The guards weren't exactly lax, but they seemed remarkably relaxed for men responsible for nearly 200 enemy prisoners. They read newspapers, played cards, and engaged in animated discussions about everything from movie stars to baseball statistics. "Look at 'em," muttered Steiner, gesturing toward a group of American soldiers, debating the merits of different brands of cigarettes. "No discipline, no focus. How did such people manage to defeat our forces in Sicily?" Klaus had been wondering the same thing, from a different perspective. The Americans seemed to approach everything, including warfare, with a casual confidence that suggested they weren't particularly worried about the outcome, as if they viewed the entire conflict as a problem to be solved by superior resources and organization, rather than a test of national will and military skill. That night, lying on his thin mattress and listening to the desert wind whistling through the barrack walls, Klaus found himself thinking about the conversation with Sergeant Martinez. The American had asked about radar technology with the air of someone who already understood its principles, not someone fishing for classified information, but someone making professional shop talk, which suggested that American radar technology was already at least as advanced as German systems, possibly more so. If that was true, what other assumptions about American technical capabilities might be wrong? The question followed him into an uneasy sleep, accompanied by the sound of coyotes howling in the distance and the steady pace of guards walking their patrols. Outside the barbed wire, the New Mexico desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any Klaus had seen in war-torn Europe. It was beautiful in an alien way, this cowboy country that seemed so far from the civilized world. He had no idea that less than 2 years later, those same stars would be outshone by the light of a man-made sun, created by the same cowboys he was learning to underestimate. The first month at Camp Sierra established a routine that Klaus found both comforting and deeply puzzling. Reveille came at 0600, followed by breakfast in the mess hall, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, and free time until lights out at 2200. It was orderly enough to satisfy German expectations of military discipline, but executed with a casual efficiency that seemed uniquely American. Klaus had been assigned to the motor pool, where he helped maintain the camp's collection of trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles. The work was familiar. He'd spent 2 years keeping Wehrmacht equipment running under combat conditions, but the American approach to maintenance was a revelation. Instead of the German system of meticulous record-keeping and rigid adherence to technical manuals, the Americans seemed to improvise solutions with whatever materials were at hand. "Don't overthink it, Klaus," advised Corporal Eddie Kowalski, the Polish-American mechanic who supervised the German work detail. "If it works, it works. We can always fix it better later." This philosophy extended to every aspect of American military culture that Klaus observed. The guards maintained security without appearing paranoid about it. The camp administrators followed regulations while showing genuine concern for prisoner welfare. Even the male censorship, which Klaus had expected to be thorough and intrusive, seemed designed more to prevent security breaches than to harass the prisoners. Most surprising of all was the Americans' attitude toward their German captives. Klaus had expected hostility, perhaps even brutality, standard treatment for enemy prisoners based on his experience with Soviet forces. Instead, he encountered something far more disconcerting: genuine curiosity about German culture, technology, and military experience. "You boys really had jets flying combat missions?" asked Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison, the camp commander, during one of his irregular visits to the work areas. Harrison was a career officer who had served in the First World War, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. But his questions about German technology came without apparent security concerns, as if he were simply discussing interesting engineering problems with colleagues. The Messerschmitt 262 was operational in limited numbers, Klaus answered carefully. "I never worked on them directly." "Fascinating stuff. Jet propulsion, swept wings, advanced metallurgy. You Germans are about 5 years ahead of us in some areas. Good thing you didn't have more of them, or this war might have gone differently." Klaus exchanged glances with Mueller, who was helping rebuild a transmission nearby. A German officer would never admit tactical disadvantages to enemy prisoners, yet Harrison seemed genuinely impressed by German technical achievements. It suggested either remarkable confidence in ultimate American victory or a level of professional respect that transcended national boundaries. The mystery deepened during their second month at the camp, when Klaus noticed increasing activity at a facility about 10 miles to the northwest. From the machine shop where he'd been reassigned, he could sometimes see convoys of trucks heading toward a complex of buildings that hadn't been there when they'd arrived. The construction was extensive: large warehouses, what appeared to be laboratory buildings, and living quarters for a substantial civilian population. "What's being built over there?" Klaus asked Sergeant Martinez during one of their frequent conversations. Martinez glanced toward the distant construction, then shrugged with characteristic American casualness. "Some kind of research facility, Defense Department stuff, electronics, communications, that sort of thing. Nothing too exciting." But Klaus noticed that Martinez's answer came a fraction of a second too quickly, and his eyes didn't quite meet Klaus's when he spoke. It was the first time the usually straightforward sergeant had seemed evasive about anything. The German prisoners began speculating about the mysterious facility during their evening gatherings. Steiner was convinced it was an intelligence center designed to interrogate high-valued prisoners. Perhaps they were being observed and evaluated for transfer to more intensive questioning. Others thought it might be a training center for American forces preparing to invade Germany itself. Klaus kept his own theories to himself, but his engineering background suggested possibilities that his fellow prisoners might not consider. The power lines being run to the facility were far heavier than necessary for a simple research center. The security was also unusual. Not just military guards, but civilian personnel who wore no uniforms but carried weapons and moved with obvious authority. Most intriguing of all were the frequent deliveries of materials that came not from standard military suppliers, but from universities and industrial laboratories. "It's some kind of advanced technical project," he confided to Mueller one evening as they walked the perimeter of their compound during free time. "The question is,
How advanced? Mueller, whose quiet demeanor concealed a sharp mind for logistics, had been making his own observations. Have you noticed the scientists? Klaus looked at his friend questioningly. The men in civilian clothes who sometimes visit the construction site. They're not soldiers or government bureaucrats. They move like university professors, distracted, intense, completely focused on whatever they're working on. I've seen that look before at technical conferences in Munich. Those are serious scientists working on serious problems. Over the following weeks, Klaus paid closer attention to these civilian visitors. Mueller was right. They had the unmistakable air of academic researchers, but with an urgency that suggested their work had immediate military applications. Some were obviously foreign-born, speaking with accents that sounded European. A few might even be German refugees who had fled the Reich before the war. The implications were disturbing. If American universities were contributing their best scientific minds to military research, it suggested a level of intellectual mobilization that Klaus hadn't fully appreciated. German propaganda had always emphasized the superior education and technical expertise of Aryan scientists, dismissing American academic institutions as shallow and materialistic. But the evidence before his eyes told a different story. One afternoon in late October, while repairing a generator in the camp's administrative building, Klaus overheard a telephone conversation that stopped him cold. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was speaking with someone at a higher headquarters, and his voice carried the sort of careful precision that indicated sensitive subject matter. Yes, sir. All construction personnel have been security cleared. No problems with the prisoner workforce. They're kept well away from sensitive areas. Estimated completion is January, assuming no delays in the uranium shipments. Uranium? Klaus felt his blood turn to ice water. Uranium was the key to nuclear fission, the foundation of the theoretical superweapons that German scientists had whispered about during the final years of his freedom. If the Americans were working with uranium in significant quantities, they weren't just researching academic theories, they were building something practical.
Klaus forced himself to continue working on the generator, fighting to keep his expression neutral while his mind raced through the implications. The mysterious facility, the brilliant scientists, the massive construction project, it all pointed toward the same terrifying conclusion. The Americans weren't just matching German scientific achievements, they were surpassing them. That evening, he found himself unable to concentrate on the usual activities. While his fellow prisoners played cards or read letters from home, Klaus stared out at the distant lights of the growing facility and tried to calculate how much time the Americans might need to complete their project. Based on his limited understanding of nuclear physics and assuming unlimited resources, perhaps 2 years, maybe less if they had already solved the key technical problems. The war might end very differently than anyone in the German camp expected. Winter in the New Mexico desert brought surprisingly cold nights and a clarity to the air that made distant objects seem close enough to touch. Klaus had been at Camp Sierra for 6 months, and the rhythm of prisoner life had become as familiar as breathing. Morning calisthenics, work assignments, meals that were consistently better than Wehrmacht field rations, and evening discussions that ranged from philosophy to engineering to homesickness for places that might no longer exist. But Klaus was no longer the same man who had arrived on that sweltering July day. 6 months of observing American methods, technology, and attitudes had shaken many of his fundamental assumptions about the war and the capabilities of his captors.
The Americans weren't the undisciplined cowboys that German propaganda described. They were something far more dangerous, a technically sophisticated democracy that had learned to mobilize its resources with ruthless efficiency. The evidence accumulated daily in small revelations that might have seemed insignificant individually, but formed a disturbing pattern when considered together. The quality of American steel in the camp's vehicles was consistently superior to German equivalents. The precision manufacturing evident in their small arms and electronic equipment rivaled anything produced by Krupp or Siemens. Most telling of all was the casual way American soldiers discussed technical innovations that German engineers considered cutting-edge secrets. "You ever work with proximity fuses?" asked Corporal Kowalski during a routine maintenance session. "We're starting to get shells with little radar sets built right into them. Damn things explode automatically when they get close to the target. No need for time fuses or direct hits." Klaus nearly dropped the wrench he was holding. Proximity fuses were theoretical weapons that German scientists had discussed but never successfully developed. The technical challenges were enormous, building radar equipment small enough and rugged enough to survive being fired from a cannon, then programming it to distinguish between targets and ground clutter. If the Americans had solved those problems and were producing such weapons in quantity— "Seems complicated," Klaus managed to say. Kowalski shrugged, with characteristic American optimism. "Our boys at Bell Labs figured it out. Amazing what you can do when you throw enough smart people at a problem." Bell Laboratories. Klaus filed the name away with dozens of others he'd collected during conversations with American personnel. Western Electric, General Electric, DuPont, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, University of California, a network of private companies and academic institutions that seemed to be working together on military projects with unprecedented coordination. It was a model of scientific mobilization that had no equivalent in Germany, where research was compartmentalized between competing institutions and hampered by ideological interference. The Americans had apparently organized their entire technical establishment around the principle that Kowalski had just articulated: throw enough smart people at a problem until someone solved it. The implications were staggering, but Klaus kept his observations to himself. His fellow prisoners were already struggling with homesickness and uncertainty about their family's fate. Learning that German technological superiority might be an illusion would serve no purpose except to demoralize them further. Besides, Klaus was beginning to suspect that several of his companions had reached similar conclusions independently. Mueller's questions about American logistics had grown increasingly sophisticated, as if he were trying to understand the full scope of the industrial system that supported Camp Sierra. Even Steiner's confident pronouncements about German wonder weapons had become less frequent, replaced by longer periods of brooding silence. The truth was that Camp Sierra itself demonstrated American capabilities that were difficult to dismiss. The facility housed nearly 300 German prisoners, plus American personnel, with a level of organization and efficiency that rivaled anything Klaus had seen in the Wehrmacht. Food, medical care, recreational activities, mail service, work assignments. Every aspect of camp life functioned smoothly, despite being administered by soldiers who seemed to approach their duties with casual informality. More impressive still was the obvious humanity of the American approach to prisoner administration. Klaus had expected harsh treatment, summary punishment for minor infractions, perhaps deliberate humiliation designed to break German morale. Instead, he encountered military professionalism tempered by genuine concern for prisoner welfare. Sick prisoners received the same medical care as American soldiers. Complaints about working conditions were investigated and often addressed. Even disciplinary measures were applied fairly and without apparent malice.
It was, Klaus realized, exactly the sort of treatment he would have wanted German forces to provide for captured Americans. The fact that his enemies were providing it, while his own countrymen were reportedly engaged in atrocities against civilian populations, was deeply unsettling. These philosophical concerns were pushed aside by more immediate worries in early December, when Klaus noticed a significant change in the activity level at the mysterious research facility. Construction that had proceeded at a steady pace for months suddenly accelerated, with work crews operating around the clock under powerful floodlights. The number of civilian scientists visiting the site increased dramatically, and Klaus began seeing faces he was certain he recognized from European academic conferences. Most disturbing of all were the deliveries. Klaus had become expert at identifying different types of military cargo during his years with the Wehrmacht, and the materials being transported to the research facility included items that made no sense for conventional weapons development. Lead blocks in unusual quantities, complex electronic equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything in current military use, and occasional shipments that arrived under security so tight that even the American camp personnel were excluded from the unloading process. "They're building something big," Mueller observed during their evening walks, "something that requires materials and expertise from all over the country." Klaus nodded grimly. The scale of the project was becoming impossible to ignore, and his engineering background suggested possibilities that his fellow prisoners wouldn't want to contemplate. Nuclear weapons weren't just theoretical concepts discussed in university classrooms. They were engineering challenges that could be solved by the same industrial methods that produced proximity fuses and advanced radar systems. If the Americans had committed their vast resources to building atomic weapons, they might succeed. And if they succeeded, the war would end in a way that no one in Germany anticipated. The first concrete evidence came in January 1945, when Klaus overheard another fragment of telephone conversation. This time, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was discussing security arrangements with his superiors, and his words carried implications that chilled Klaus to the bone. All prisoner personnel had been cleared for extended duty. "No, sir, no special precautions necessary. They'll be at least 50 miles from the test site. Estimated yield is still classified, but fallout patterns suggest we should evacuate the area within a 20-mile radius." Test site, yield, fallout. Klaus knew enough physics to understand what those terms meant when used together. The Americans weren't just researching atomic weapons, they were preparing to test one. That night, Klaus lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to calculate timelines. If the Americans were planning to test a nuclear weapon within the next few months, they might have deployable weapons by summer. Germany's situation was already desperate, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin and Allied armies pouring across the Rhine. The addition of atomic weapons to the Allied arsenal would make German defeat not just inevitable, but catastrophically final. For the first time since his capture, Klaus found himself hoping that the war would end quickly before the Americans could demonstrate their new weapon. Because once they proved that such devices were practical, the entire nature of warfare would change forever. The Cowboys weren't cowboys after all. They were atomic pioneers, and they were about to reshape the world. February brought unseasonably warm weather to the New Mexico desert, but Klaus felt a growing chill as he observed the intensifying activity at the research facility. What had once been a mysterious construction project was now clearly revealed as something far more ambitious and terrifying. The buildings were complete, their clean lines and utilitarian design suggesting facilities built for precision work rather than comfort. More telling were the people, hundreds of them now, arriving daily in government vehicles and taking up residence in the newly constructed dormitories. Klaus had taken to volunteering for work details that brought him closer to the perimeter fence, ostensibly to maintain vehicles, but actually to observe the comings and goings at the facility. What he saw there challenged everything he thought he understood about American scientific capabilities. The men and women working at the site moved with the focused intensity of people engaged in history-making work. Klaus recognized the signs from his brief time at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute before the war, the same mixture of exhaustion and excitement that characterized breakthrough research. But the scale here was unprecedented. Germany's entire nuclear research program had employed perhaps 50 scientists. The American facility appeared to house 10 times that number. Those aren't just researchers, observed Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, the former university professor who had become Klaus's closest confidant among the prisoners. Zimmermann had been captured during the retreat from France, and his background in theoretical physics made Klaus's most valuable ally in interpreting what they were witnessing. Those aren't just researchers. Look at the way they're organized. That's industrial-scale scientific research, something I've never seen before. Klaus nodded, watching a convoy of trucks deliver what appeared to be precision machinery to one of the laboratory buildings. How long would it take them to produce results?
Zimmermann considered the question carefully. If they're working on what I think they're working on, with unlimited resources and the best minds from every major university in America? He paused, his weathered face grave. 6 months, maybe less. The implications were staggering. Klaus had been hoping that German surrender would come before the Americans could complete their atomic weapons program, ending the war through conventional defeat rather than nuclear annihilation. But if Zimmermann's estimate was correct, the Americans might have operational weapons before German resistance collapsed. Their observations were interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Martinez, who approached with his usual friendly smile but carrying official paperwork that suggested serious business. "Klaus, Dr. Zimmermann, Colonel Harrison wants to see you both in his office. Something about work reassignments." Klaus felt his stomach drop. Work reassignments could mean many things, none of them necessarily good. Had someone noticed their surveillance of the research facility? Were they being transferred to a more secure location, or worse, selected for intensive interrogation? The walk to the administration building took only 5 minutes, but Klaus used the time to review everything he had observed and discussed over the past 7 months. If the Americans had discovered his growing understanding of their atomic weapons program, they might decide that he represented a security risk that needed to be eliminated. But Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's office was surprisingly welcoming. The camp commander sat behind his desk, flanked by 2 men in civilian clothes who looked like university professors. One was elderly, with wild white hair and thick glasses. The other was younger, perhaps 40, with the intense gaze that Klaus associated with theoretical physicists. "Gentlemen," Harrison began without preamble, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Robert Wilson and Dr. Philip Morrison from the University of California. They've requested permission to speak with prisoners who have scientific backgrounds." Klaus exchanged glances with Zimmermann, both of them struggling to maintain neutral expressions. Were they about to be interrogated about German nuclear research? Had the Americans identified them as potential sources of intelligence about Wehrmacht technical capabilities? Dr. Wilson leaned forward, his manner more academic than military. "We're not here to question you about classified German research," he said, as if reading their thoughts. "In fact, we're here to discuss something quite different. How much do you know about American atomic research?" The question was so unexpected that Klaus almost laughed. I'm sorry. "We're working on a project that will fundamentally change the nature of warfare. Within months, we'll be testing a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. We think it's important that intelligent people, including our prisoners, understand what that means for the future." Klaus stared at the 2 scientists, trying to process what he was hearing. Were the Americans actually going to reveal details of their atomic weapons program to German prisoners? It seemed impossible, a violation of every security protocol he could imagine. "Why are you telling us this?" Zimmermann asked, his voice carefully controlled. Dr. Wilson removed his glasses and cleaned them methodically. "Because this isn't just an American weapon or an Allied weapon. This is a human weapon, something that affects all of us regardless of nationality. The decisions we make about how to use it will shape civilization for generations to come."
And, Dr. Morrison added, because we need people to understand the science behind it. public ignorance about atomic energy could be as dangerous as the weapons themselves. Educated men like yourselves could help ensure that future generations approach this technology responsibly. Klaus felt the world shifting around him. The Americans weren't just building atomic weapons, they were thinking about the post-war world and the role that nuclear technology would play in it. More than that, they were treating German prisoners as potential partners in educating humanity about the atomic age, rather than simply enemies to be defeated and discarded. "What exactly are you proposing?" Klaus asked carefully. "Educational seminars," Dr. Wilson explained. "We'd like to give you and other technically trained prisoners a basic understanding of atomic physics, nuclear fission, and the potential applications of atomic energy, both military and civilian. In return, we hope you'll help us understand how the German people might react to news of these developments." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison intervened. "This is entirely voluntary, of course. No prisoner will be required to participate, and your responses won't affect your treatment here. But we believe that the more people understand about atomic energy, the better prepared humanity will be for the atomic age." Klaus looked at Zimmermann, seeing his own mixture of fascination and fear reflected in the older man's eyes. They were being offered a front-row seat to one of the most important scientific developments in human history. But they were also being asked to help their captors understand how to manage the psychological impact of weapons that could destroy entire cities. "When would these seminars begin?" Zimmermann asked. "Next week," Dr. Morrison replied. "We're planning a series of 6 sessions covering basic atomic theory, nuclear fission, and weapons design principles, and potential peaceful applications of atomic energy. No classified details, of course, but enough to give you a solid foundation in the science." Klaus felt a surge of scientific curiosity that overwhelmed his concerns about the military implications. The opportunity to learn about cutting-edge physics from the men who were actually developing these technologies was unprecedented. It was also potentially invaluable intelligence about American capabilities and intentions. "I'll participate," he heard himself saying. Zimmermann nodded agreement. "As will I." Dr. Wilson smiled for the first time since the interview began. "Excellent. We'll start Monday morning at 0900 hours in Conference Room B. Please spread the word among your fellow prisoners. Anyone with technical training is welcome to attend." As they left the administration building, Klaus found himself struggling to understand what had just happened. The Americans had not only revealed that they were developing atomic weapons, but they had offered to educate their prisoners about the technology. It suggested a level of confidence in ultimate victory that was almost breathtaking. "Why would they do this?" Klaus asked as they walked back toward the prisoner compound. Zimmermann was quiet for several minutes before answering. "Because they believe they're going to win the war decisively, and they want to manage the peace responsibly. They're not just thinking about defeating Germany, they're thinking about rebuilding civilization after they have demonstrated the destructive power of atomic weapons." That evening, word of the proposed seminars spread through the prisoner compound like wildfire. Reactions ranged from excitement to suspicion to outright disbelief. Some prisoners saw it as an opportunity to gather intelligence about American capabilities. Others suspected a psychological warfare operation designed to convince them that German defeat was inevitable. Steiner was vocally opposed to the entire proposition. "It's a trick," he declared during the evening discussion in the common room. "They want to demoralize us with stories of their supposed superweapons. Or worse, they're trying to identify prisoners with technical knowledge who might be useful for intelligence purposes." But Klaus noticed that even Steiner couldn't entirely hide his curiosity. The former panzer commander had studied engineering before the war,
and the opportunity to learn about cutting-edge technology was clearly tempting despite his suspicions. "What if it's real?" asked Obergefreiter Paul Richter, a former Luftwaffe radar operator whose technical background had made him one of Klaus's frequent discussion partners. "What if they really have built atomic weapons? Shouldn't we understand what that means?" The debate continued late into the evening, but Klaus had already made his decision. Monday morning found him in Conference Room B, along with Zimmerman and 14 other prisoners whose backgrounds ranged from electrical engineering to theoretical mathematics. The room had been arranged like a university lecture hall, with chairs facing a blackboard and projection screen. Dr. Wilson began without ceremony, launching into a discussion of atomic structure that started with basic chemistry and quickly moved into advanced physics. The atom consists of a nucleus containing protons and neutrons surrounded by orbiting electrons, he explained, sketching diagrams on the blackboard with practiced ease. For most practical purposes, the nucleus is incredibly stable, but certain heavy elements, uranium, plutonium, have nuclei that can be split under the right conditions. Klaus found himself taking detailed notes, his engineering background helping him follow the mathematical relationships that Dr. Wilson described. The science was complex but comprehensible, and Wilson's teaching style was clear and methodical. What struck Klaus most was the obvious passion in the scientist's voice. This wasn't propaganda or psychological warfare, but genuine education from a man who clearly loved his subject. When a uranium-235 nucleus absorbs a neutron, it becomes unstable and splits into two smaller nuclei, releasing energy and additional neutrons. Those neutrons can then split other uranium nuclei, creating a chain reaction. Under controlled conditions, this can be used to generate power. Under uncontrolled conditions, he paused, letting the implications sink in. Under uncontrolled conditions, you get an explosion equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives from a device no larger than this room. Dr. Morrison took over the next portion of the lecture, discussing the practical challenges of creating a nuclear weapon. The difficulty isn't in the physics, that's well understood. The challenge is in engineering. You need pure uranium-235 or plutonium-239, both of which are incredibly difficult to produce in useful quantities. You need precise timing mechanisms to initiate the chain reaction at exactly the right moment. And you need a delivery system capable of carrying a weapon that weighs several tons. Klaus felt a chill as he realized the implications of Morrison's casual mention of delivery systems. The Americans weren't just building laboratory demonstrations, they were developing practical weapons designed for battlefield use. The session ended with Wilson displaying a series of photographs showing the construction site that Klaus had been observing from the camp. What you've been seeing is Los Alamos, the primary facility for American atomic weapons research. Over 3,000 people work there now, including many of the finest scientists in the world. Klaus stared at the photographs, recognizing buildings he had watched being constructed over the past months. The scale was even more impressive than he had imagined. Los Alamos was essentially a small city dedicated entirely to nuclear weapons development.
After the seminar, Klaus walked back to the prisoner compound in stunned silence. The reality of American atomic capabilities was far beyond what he had imagined. This wasn't a small research program hoping to achieve theoretical breakthroughs. It was an industrial-scale effort that had already solved the major technical challenges and was moving toward practical weapons. "Well?" Zimmerman asked, as they settled into their bunks that evening. "It's real," Klaus replied quietly. "Everything we suspected and more. They're not just researching atomic weapons, they're building them on an assembly line basis." The news spread through the prisoner compound like a contagion. Some prisoners refused to believe it, dismissing the seminars as elaborate propaganda designed to hasten German surrender. Others became deeply depressed as they contemplated the implications for their homeland. A few, like Klaus, found themselves fascinated despite their growing dread. The second seminar, held 3 days later, focused on the practical effects of nuclear weapons. Dr. Morrison presented calculations showing the blast radius, thermal effects, and radiation damage that would result from a 20-kiloton atomic bomb, the approximate yield of the weapon being developed at Los Alamos. A single atomic bomb detonated over a city would destroy everything within a 2-mile radius. The thermal pulse would cause severe burns up to 5 miles away. The radiation would make the central area uninhabitable for decades. Klaus found himself thinking of Berlin, Cologne, Hamburg, German cities that could be obliterated by single weapons dropped from individual aircraft. No air defense system could stop every bomber, and even one successful attack would cause devastation beyond anything in military history. "When will these weapons be ready?" asked Dr. Zimmerman during the question period. Dr. Wilson exchanged glances with Morrison before answering. "The first device will be tested within 3 months. If the test is successful, operational weapons could be available by summer." Summer. Klaus felt his heart sink as he realized what that timeline meant. The war in Europe might last until summer, giving the Americans time to deploy atomic weapons against German cities. The thought of nuclear fire consuming the streets where he had grown up, the university where he had studied, the neighborhoods where his family lived, was almost unbearable. But even more disturbing was the growing realization that the Americans were sharing this information willingly. They weren't extracting intelligence from their prisoners, they were providing it, which suggested that they believed German defeat was so inevitable that the details of their weapons program no longer mattered. The third seminar addressed the strategic implications of nuclear weapons. Dr. Wilson discussed how nuclear technology would reshape international relations, making traditional concepts of military superiority obsolete. No nation that possesses atomic weapons can be successfully invaded, but no nation is safe from atomic attack if its enemies also possess these weapons. We're entering an era where warfare between major powers could mean the destruction of civilization itself. Klaus found himself thinking about the post-war world that these weapons would create. Germany would be defeated, certainly. But what would happen to the victorious powers when they all possessed weapons capable of destroying each other's cities? How could any government maintain security when a single enemy bomber could eliminate an entire metropolis? That's why international cooperation will be essential, Dr. Morrison added, as if reading Klaus's thoughts. The scientific principles behind atomic energy can't be kept secret forever. Other nations will develop these weapons eventually. Our only hope for long-term peace is to establish international controls over atomic technology before it spreads too widely. After the seminar, Klaus found himself walking the perimeter of the compound with Zimmerman, both of them struggling to process what they were learning. The stars overhead seemed different now, more distant perhaps, in a universe where human beings had learned to harness the forces that powered the sun. "They're not just trying to win the war," Zimmerman observed. "They're trying to manage the peace that comes after they've demonstrated that cities can be destroyed by individual weapons." Klaus nodded slowly. "They want us to understand, because they know we'll be going back to Germany eventually. They want German scientists and engineers to help explain to the German people why resistance is futile."
It was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, but one that relied on education rather than intimidation. The Americans were betting that informed German prisoners would be more effective at conveying the reality of atomic weapons than any propaganda campaign. The strategy was working. Klaus could see the change in his fellow prisoners over the following weeks. Men who had maintained hope for German victory through 2 years of captivity were now openly discussing the terms of surrender. The atomic seminars had accomplished what no amount of battlefield news had managed. They had convinced the prisoners that continuing the war would mean national suicide. The fourth seminar in early March focused on the peaceful applications of atomic energy. Dr. Wilson's enthusiasm was infectious as he described power plants that could generate electricity for entire cities using fuel no larger than a golf ball, medical isotopes that could cure cancer, and propulsion systems that could send rockets to the moon. Atomic energy isn't just about weapons, he emphasized. The same principles that make nuclear bombs possible can also provide virtually unlimited clean energy for human civilization. The atoms in a glass of water contain enough energy to power a city for a year. We just need to learn how to release it safely and control it precisely. Klaus found himself caught between wonder and horror as he contemplated these possibilities. The technology that could incinerate cities could also eliminate poverty and power fantastic achievements. It was the ultimate double-edged sword, capable of destroying humanity or elevating it to unprecedented heights. But the focus on peaceful applications couldn't disguise the immediate military reality. The Americans were building weapons first, with peaceful uses to follow after the war. Klaus had to admire the logic, establish dominance through superior firepower, then use that dominance to create a stable international order based on atomic deterrence. After the seminar, Klaus was approached by Sergeant Martinez, who had been observing the educational sessions with obvious interest. "What do you think about all this atomic stuff?" Martinez asked with his characteristic directness. Klaus considered his answer carefully. Martinez had always been friendly, but he was still an American soldier responsible for camp security. "It's impressive science," he replied neutrally. "But scary as hell, right?" Martinez grinned, but Klaus could see genuine concern in his eyes. "I mean, when I signed up to fight Nazis, I figured we'd be shooting at each other with rifles and maybe dropping some bombs on factories. This atomic stuff, it's like something out of a science fiction magazine." Klaus found himself drawn into a more serious conversation than he had expected. "How do the American soldiers feel about it?" he asked. Martinez glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then lowered his voice. "Honestly, most of us are scared. We know it means we'll win the war, but after that, who knows what happens when every country starts building these things. My kid brother is studying physics at college. He says atomic energy could make the whole world rich and peaceful, but it could also turn the whole world into a graveyard." It was the first time Klaus had heard an American express doubt about their atomic weapons program, and it humanized his captors in an unexpected way. They weren't evil masterminds plotting world domination. They were ordinary people grappling with technology that had exceeded their ability to understand its consequences. "What does your government plan to do with these weapons after Germany surrenders?" Klaus asked. Martinez shrugged. "That's way above my pay grade. But from what I hear, President Truman wants to use them to keep the peace, make war too dangerous for anybody to start, maybe share the technology with other countries under some kind of international agreement."
Klaus felt a surge of hope at the mention of international cooperation. If the Americans were serious about sharing atomic technology under controlled conditions, there might be a path to a peaceful atomic age. But he also knew enough about international politics to doubt that any such cooperation would last long once other nations developed their own weapons. The fifth seminar, held in late March, focused on the immediate plans for using atomic weapons against Japan. Dr. Morrison explained that the Pacific War was expected to continue for at least another year,
with an invasion of the Japanese home islands requiring hundreds of thousands of American casualties. "Atomic weapons offer an alternative," Morrison said quietly, "a demonstration of overwhelming force that might convince the Japanese government to surrender without further fighting. 1 or 2 atomic bombs might save more lives than they destroy if they prevent a prolonged invasion." Klaus found himself in the uncomfortable position of hoping that the Americans would succeed in forcing Japanese surrender through atomic intimidation. As a German prisoner, he had no particular sympathy for Japan's military government, but as a human being, he was horrified by the prospect of atomic weapons being used against civilian populations. "Will you target military installations or cities?" asked Zimmerman. Dr. Wilson hesitated before answering. "The targets haven't been finalized, but they'll be chosen to demonstrate the full destructive power of atomic weapons. Military targets might not provide a sufficiently impressive demonstration." The implications were clear. The Americans were planning to destroy Japanese cities to force surrender, and they were willing to discuss this openly with German prisoners because they wanted the knowledge to spread. Every prisoner who eventually returned to Germany would carry the message that resistance to American atomic weapons was hopeless. Klaus realized that he was witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare, one in which the threat of overwhelming destruction was as important as the actual use of weapons. The Americans weren't just building atomic bombs, they were creating a system of atomic diplomacy that would reshape international relations for generations. The final seminar, conducted in early April, brought everything together in a comprehensive discussion of the atomic age. Dr. Wilson spoke with obvious passion about the opportunities and dangers that atomic energy would create, while Dr. Morrison focused on the practical challenges of managing nuclear technology in a world of competing nations. "The decisions made in the next few years will determine whether atomic energy becomes humanity's greatest achievement or its final mistake," Wilson concluded. "We need educated people in every country to help guide those decisions wisely." As the seminar series ended, Klaus found himself profoundly changed by what he had learned. The war that had begun with cavalry charges and bolt-action rifles was ending with weapons that could destroy entire cities. The world that emerged from this conflict would be fundamentally different from anything in human history, and Klaus would be among the few Germans who understood what that meant.
But understanding brought its own burdens. Klaus now knew that German defeat was not just inevitable, but necessary. Continuing to fight would only invite atomic destruction. He also knew that the post-war world would be dominated by the United States, at least until other nations developed their own atomic weapons. Most troubling of all, he knew that the technology unleashed by the Manhattan Project would eventually spread to other countries, creating a future where any international crisis could escalate to nuclear war. On the morning of July 16, 1945, Klaus was awakened not by reveille, but by a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a low rumble that built slowly into a crescendo that rattled windows and set dogs howling throughout the camp. He rushed to the barracks window in time to see a flash of light on the distant horizon, brighter than the sun that turned the pre-dawn darkness into momentary noon. The light faded, but Klaus continued staring toward the south, where a column of smoke and debris was rising into the stratosphere. It climbed steadily, spreading at the top until the distinctive mushroom shape that would become the symbol of the atomic age. Even at a distance of 50 miles, the sight was terrifying in its obvious power. "Mein Gott," whispered Mueller from the bunk next to Klaus's. "They actually did it." Within minutes, every prisoner in the compound was awake and pressing against windows or gathering in the common areas, all trying to understand what they had witnessed. The American guards seemed as stunned as their prisoners,
Many of them had known that a test was planned, but seeing the reality of atomic weapons was clearly different from reading technical reports. Klaus found himself thinking of the seminars, the patient explanations of nuclear physics, the careful descriptions of blast effects and radiation damage. All of that theoretical knowledge had suddenly become real in the form of a man-made star that had briefly outshone the sun itself. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison addressed the entire camp over the loudspeaker system at 800 hours. His voice was steady, but carried undertones of awe that he couldn't quite suppress. At 05:29 hours this morning, the United States successfully tested an atomic weapon at a site approximately 50 miles south of this camp. The test was conducted under controlled conditions with no danger to personnel at Camp Sierra. All prisoners and staff are to remain within the compound until further notice while we monitor for any possible radiation effects. Klaus exchanged glances with Zimmerman, both of them understanding the historical significance of what they'd witnessed. Humanity had entered the atomic age, and there was no path back to the simpler world they had known before that flash of artificial sunlight. The next few days brought a steady stream of information as news of the test spread throughout the American military. Klaus learned from conversations with guards that the explosion had exceeded all expectations, producing a yield equivalent to nearly 20,000 tons of TNT. The tower that had supported the bomb had been completely vaporized, along with the surrounding desert sand, which had been turned into a green glass called Trinitite. More ominously, Klaus learned that the successful test meant atomic weapons would soon be used against Japan. President Truman had already approved their deployment, and preparations were underway to load the weapons aboard specially modified B-29 bombers. "They're really going to drop one on the Japanese city," Klaus confided in Zimmerman during their evening walk. "Everything we discussed in the seminars is actually going to happen." Zimmerman nodded grimly. "And after that, the world changes forever. No nation will be safe from atomic attack, but no nation will dare fight another that possesses these weapons." Klaus found himself torn between relief and horror. Relief because atomic weapons would end the war quickly, preventing the prolonged carnage of an invasion of Japan, and possibly saving German cities from atomic attack if the war in Europe had continued. Horror because he was witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare that could destroy civilization itself. The news came on August 6th. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. The initial reports were sparse, but Klaus could read between the lines. An entire city had been destroyed by a single weapon, just as the American scientists had predicted during their educational seminars.
3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, citing a new and most cruel bomb as one of the factors that made continued resistance impossible. Klaus listened to the surrender announcement over the camp's radio system, understanding enough English to follow the emperor's words. The war was over, ended not by conventional military victory, but by the demonstration of atomic power. The Cowboys had indeed built the ultimate weapon, and they had used it to impose peace through overwhelming force. That evening, as the prisoners gathered to discuss the news of Japanese surrender, Klaus found himself reflecting on everything he had learned during his 2 years at Camp Sierra. The Americans hadn't been the undisciplined cowboys that German propaganda had described. They had been atomic pioneers, applying industrial-scale organization and unlimited resources to the most complex scientific project in human history. More than that, they had been educators, sharing their knowledge even with enemy prisoners because they understood that the atomic age would require informed global cooperation. Klaus now realized that the seminars hadn't been propaganda or intelligence gathering. They had been preparation for a world where atomic weapons made traditional concepts of military secrecy obsolete. The technology would spread. Other nations would develop their own atomic weapons.
The challenge for future generations would be learning to live with the knowledge that human civilization balanced on the edge of nuclear destruction, maintained only by the wisdom and restraint of political leaders who controlled weapons capable of ending the world. Klaus was among the first German prisoners to be repatriated after the war ended. As his transport ship approached the bombed-out harbor of Bremen in October 1945, he thought about the message he would carry back to his defeated homeland. Germany had lost the war not because of superior Allied strategy or courage, but because the Americans had organized their scientific and industrial resources more effectively than any nation in history. The atomic Cowboys had won, and the world would never be the same. Standing on the ship's deck, watching the ruined German coastline approach, Klaus carried with him the burden of atomic knowledge. He understood the science, the politics, and the terrible responsibility that came with weapons capable of destroying cities. In the months and years ahead, he would help educate the German people about the atomic age and the new reality of international relations in a nuclear world. The flash of light he had witnessed on that July morning in the New Mexico desert had marked more than the successful test of an atomic weapon. It had marked the end of one era of human history and the beginning of another, an era in which the Cowboys had proven themselves capable of harnessing the power of the stars themselves. And Klaus Weber, former Obergefreiter of the Wehrmacht, had been there to witness the dawn of the atomic age. 20 years later, Los Alamos, New Mexico, July 1965. Dr. Klaus Weber adjusted his tie nervously as he approached the main gate of Los Alamos National Laboratory. The security checkpoint looked much the same as it had during the war years, though the guards now wore different uniforms, and the facilities beyond the fence had expanded dramatically. Klaus presented his visitor's badge to the guard, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, born after the atomic age had already begun.
Dr. Weber, you're here for the anniversary symposium. The guard's accent was pure American Southwest, probably born and raised in New Mexico. Building 43, sir. Dr. Wilson is expecting you. 20 years. Klaus could hardly believe how quickly the time had passed since that morning when artificial sunlight had briefly outshone the dawn. He had returned to Germany as promised, carrying with him the burden of atomic knowledge and the responsibility to help his countrymen understand the new world they were entering. The work had been difficult, educating a defeated nation about technologies that their former enemies had mastered while Germany lay in ruins. But Klaus had found purpose in that education. He had helped establish Germany's first civilian nuclear program, focusing on peaceful applications of atomic energy. German nuclear reactors now generated electricity for cities that had been bombed flat during the war. German scientists worked alongside their former enemies in international organizations dedicated to controlling the spread of nuclear weapons. The cowboy country that had once seemed like the end of the world had become the birthplace of a new era of scientific cooperation. Walking through the familiar streets of Los Alamos, Klaus marveled at how much the place had changed. What had been a secret wartime laboratory was now a permanent research city, home to thousands of scientists and their families. Children rode bicycles down streets named after physicists. Teenagers attended the same high school where the sons and daughters of atomic pioneers learned about the world their parents had created. Dr. Robert Wilson met him at the entrance to the administrative building, his hair now completely white, but his eyes still bright with the intellectual curiosity that Klaus remembered from those educational seminars 20 years ago. "Klaus, you made it. How was the flight from Frankfurt?" "Long, but comfortable," Klaus replied, shaking hands with the man who had first taught him the principles of nuclear fission. "It is remarkable to be back here." Wilson led him through corridors lined with photographs documenting the laboratory's history.
Klaus recognized many of the faces, scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project and then stayed to develop peaceful applications of atomic energy. Oppenheimer looking haggard after the security hearings that had destroyed his career. Fermi examining the first nuclear reactor. Teller advocating for the hydrogen bomb that had made atomic weapons obsolete almost before they were fully deployed. "The world has changed more than any of us expected," Wilson observed, as they passed a display showing atoms for peace programs around the globe. "When we were building that first bomb, we thought we were ending one war. We didn't realize we were preventing all future wars between major powers." Klaus nodded thoughtfully. The nuclear stalemate between America and the Soviet Union had indeed prevented another world war, but it had also created a permanent state of tension that shaped every aspect of international relations. Germany itself had become a symbol of this nuclear peace, divided between East and West, with both sides possessing enough atomic weapons to destroy human civilization, but neither daring to use them. "Dr. Zimmerman sends his regards," Klaus said as they reached Wilson's office. "He is too frail to travel now, but he wanted me to convey his gratitude for those seminars you conducted. He says they changed his understanding of what science means for humanity." Wilson smiled sadly. "Heinrich was one of our most thoughtful students. How is he managing retirement?" "He spends most of his time writing memoirs about his experience as a prisoner of war. Publishers are very interested in first-hand accounts of the Manhattan Project, even from the perspective of German prisoners. Especially from that perspective, actually."
They settled into comfortable chairs overlooking the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the same peaks that Klaus had watched from the prison compound 2 decades earlier. The view was unchanged, but everything else about their relationship had been transformed. Former enemies had become colleagues. Prisoners had become partners in building a peaceful atomic future. "Tell me about your work in Germany," Wilson requested. "I've read about the reactor program, but I'd like to hear about it from someone who was there from the beginning." Klaus spent the next hour describing his role in establishing West Germany's civilian nuclear program. It had been challenging work, convincing a defeated nation that atomic energy could serve peaceful purposes rather than military ones, training a new generation of German scientists in technologies their country had been forbidden to develop, building international partnerships with the same countries that had bombed German cities into rubble. "The irony wasn't lost on any of us," Klaus explained. "American scientists taught German prisoners about atomic physics in 1945. By 1955, German scientists were working alongside Americans to develop peaceful uses for atomic energy. By 1965, we're all collaborating to prevent other nations from developing atomic weapons." Wilson leaned back in his chair, contemplating the complexities of nuclear diplomacy. "Did you ever imagine, during those seminars, that atomic energy would spread so quickly? We have 6 nuclear powers now, with more nations seeking to join the club every year." Klaus shook his head. "In 1945, I thought atomic weapons would remain American secrets for decades. I certainly didn't expect that Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union would all develop their own bombs within 20 years. The technology spread faster than anyone predicted." "Which brings us to the central challenge of our time," Wilson said gravely. "How do we maintain peace when atomic weapons are becoming commonplace? The nuclear umbrella that has prevented major wars between great powers may not work when every regional conflict could escalate to nuclear exchanges." It was a question that Klaus had wrestled with throughout his post-war career. Nuclear deterrence worked when only a few responsible powers possessed atomic weapons. But as the technology spread to smaller nations, the calculations became more complex and dangerous. A nuclear war between India and Pakistan could kill millions. A Middle Eastern conflict involving nuclear weapons could destabilize the entire global economy. Even a limited nuclear exchange in Europe could trigger the superpower confrontation that everyone had worked so hard to prevent.
That's why education remains so important, Klaus replied. Every nation that develops nuclear capability needs leaders who understand the technology and its implications. The seminars you conducted for German prisoners weren't just about physics, they were about responsibility. Wilson smiled at the memory. I still remember how skeptical you all were at first. German prisoners being taught nuclear physics by their American captors? It must have seemed like an elaborate psychological warfare operation. It was, in a way, but not the kind we expected. You weren't trying to break our morale. You were trying to prepare us for the atomic age. You understood that nuclear knowledge would eventually spread, and you wanted to ensure that it spread to educated people who could use it responsibly. They were interrupted by Wilson's secretary, who announced that the anniversary symposium would begin in 30 minutes. Klaus gathered his notes and prepared to deliver the keynote address he had spent months preparing. The title was From Prisoners to Partners, German Perspectives on the Atomic Age, and it would be his opportunity to share what he had learned about the relationship between nuclear technology and international cooperation. The auditorium was packed with scientists, government officials, and journalists from around the world. Klaus recognized many faces from the international nuclear community: physicists who had worked on peaceful applications of atomic energy, diplomats who negotiated arms control agreements, engineers who designed safer reactor systems. All of them were grappling with the challenges of managing technologies that could either power human civilization or destroy it. Klaus began his address by describing his arrival at Camp Sierra in July 1943, when he had dismissed his American captors as undisciplined cowboys who lacked the scientific sophistication necessary for advanced warfare. The audience chuckled at his admission of cultural prejudice, but Klaus emphasized the serious lesson it contained.
I was wrong about American capabilities because I misunderstood American methods, he explained. German science was organized around rigid hierarchies and theoretical purity. American science was organized around practical problem-solving and institutional cooperation. When applied to nuclear physics, the American approach proved far more effective. He described the educational seminars that Wilson and Morrison had conducted, emphasizing how they had opened German prisoners' eyes to both the potential and the dangers of atomic energy. Most importantly, the seminars had demonstrated that nuclear technology created shared responsibilities that transcended national boundaries. Nuclear weapons changed the nature of national security, Klaus continued. For the first time in history, every nation's survival depends partly on the wisdom and restraint of other nations' leaders. This interdependence requires new forms of international cooperation based on shared understanding of nuclear technology. Klaus spent the remainder of his address discussing the post-war development of civilian nuclear programs, international arms control agreements, and the ongoing challenges of nuclear proliferation. He emphasized that the atomic age had created both unprecedented dangers and unprecedented opportunities for human cooperation. 20 years ago, I watched the first atomic weapon detonate from a distance of 50 miles, he concluded. That flash of light marked the end of one era of human history and the beginning of another. We are still learning how to live in the world that was born in that moment. But I believe that the same scientific cooperation that created atomic weapons can help us control them and harness their peaceful potential. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, but Klaus knew that the real work lay ahead. Nuclear proliferation continued despite international efforts to control it. Regional conflicts threatened to escalate into nuclear exchanges. The delicate balance of deterrence that had maintained peace between superpowers might not survive the spread of atomic weapons to less stable regions.
After the symposium, Klaus joined Wilson and several other Manhattan Project veterans for dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Rio Grande Valley. The conversation ranged from technical discussions of reactor design to philosophical debates about the moral responsibilities of scientists who create technologies with dual-use potential. "Do you ever regret working on the bomb?" asked Dr. Morrison, now director of the laboratory's Theoretical Physics Division. Wilson considered the question carefully. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret that we built it before Nazi Germany did. And I don't regret that we've used our nuclear monopoly, however briefly we held it, to create international institutions for controlling atomic weapons." Klaus raised his glass in a toast to the atomic cowboys, who built weapons that ended one war and may yet prevent all future wars. The others joined the toast, but Klaus could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They had created technologies that could destroy civilization, but they had also created the scientific cooperation that might preserve it. The atomic age would be defined by humanity's ability to manage that paradox.
Klaus stood alone on the balcony of his hotel room, looking out over the lights of Los Alamos and the dark mountains beyond. Somewhere in the distance, past those peaks, lay the site where Trinity had detonated 20 years ago. The crater was still there, though it had been filled and covered with concrete. Trinitite, the green glass created by atomic fire, could still be found by visitors who knew where to look. He thought about Sergeant Martinez, the friendly mess cook who had asked casual questions about German radar technology. Martinez had died in Korea, Klaus had learned, killed by Chinese artillery during the retreat from Seoul. He had lived just long enough to see atomic weapons prevent a Third World War, but not long enough to see the peaceful applications of nuclear technology that he had hoped for. Klaus thought about Dr. Zimmermann, now in his 80s, and struggling with the memory loss that seemed to claim so many of the men who had witnessed the birth of the atomic age. The old professor still remembered the seminars clearly, though he sometimes forgot what he had eaten for breakfast. The atomic knowledge remained sharp while other memories faded. Most of all, Klaus thought about the young guard at the laboratory gate, born into a world where atomic weapons were simply a fact of life, like automobiles or television sets. That young man would never know what it felt like to live in a world where cities could not be destroyed by individual weapons. For him, nuclear deterrence and international arms control would be natural features of the political landscape rather than desperate improvisations designed to prevent human extinction. Perhaps that was progress. Perhaps the atomic age would truly begin when nuclear weapons became so thoroughly integrated into international relations that no one could imagine using them. Perhaps the Cowboys had indeed found a way to make atomic warfare obsolete through the very act of making it possible. Klaus finished his whiskey and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow he would fly back to Germany and continue his work on peaceful nuclear technology. The atomic age was still young, barely 2 decades old, and its ultimate direction remained uncertain. But Klaus had learned to be optimistic about humanity's ability to adapt to the technologies it created. The Cowboys had surprised him once by demonstrating greater scientific sophistication than he had expected. Perhaps they would surprise him again by proving that atomic weapons could coexist with human civilization without destroying it. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate, which was perhaps the most important lesson of the atomic age. Some technologies were so dangerous that humanity had no choice but to learn to manage them wisely. The stars above Los Alamos shone with the same light that powered the atomic weapons sleeping in missile silos around the world.
but they also powered the fusion reactors that might someday provide unlimited clean energy for human civilization. The difference between atomic destruction and atomic prosperity would be determined by the wisdom of the men and women who had inherited the legacy of the Manhattan Project.
Klaus Weber, former German prisoner of war and current advocate for peaceful nuclear technology, fell asleep that night confident that the atomic cowboys had chosen the right path. Time would tell whether the rest of humanity had the wisdom to follow it. As Klaus Weber's story demonstrates, the atomic age transformed not just the nature of warfare, but the entire relationship between science, technology, and international cooperation. The American scientists who educated German prisoners about nuclear physics were not just sharing technical knowledge, they were modeling a new form of global citizenship that transcended national boundaries. The atomic cowboys of Los Alamos proved that democracy and scientific freedom could produce technologies that totalitarian regimes could not match. But they also proved that such technologies created responsibilities that no single nation could bear alone. The nuclear age required unprecedented levels of international cooperation, arms control agreements, and shared commitment to preventing atomic warfare. Klaus Weber's story demonstrates how the atomic age changed individual lives as well as global politics. Men and women who had fought each other with conventional weapons found themselves working together to control technologies that could destroy civilization. Former enemies became partners in the most important scientific challenge of the modern era, learning to live with atomic weapons without being destroyed by them. The flash of light that Klaus witnessed on July 16, 1945, marked more than the successful test of an atomic weapon. It marked the beginning of an ongoing experiment in human wisdom and restraint that continues to this day. The atomic cowboys who created that light also created the international institutions and scientific cooperation that may yet ensure that atomic weapons remain weapons of deterrence rather than destruction. Whether that experiment succeeds or fails will depend on the choices made by future generations who inherit both the benefits and the burdens of atomic technology. The atomic age is still young, and its final chapter has yet to be written. If this story moved you, challenged you, or simply entertained you for the past few hours, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with friends who appreciate deep, thoughtful storytelling. Your engagement helps us continue creating these detailed historical narratives that bring the past to life in vivid detail. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. We have more incredible tales in development, stories of exploration, innovation, conflict, and human triumph that will take you to places you've never been and times you've never experienced. Until next time, keep exploring the remarkable stories that have shaped our world. The past is full of cowboys who turned out to be pioneers, and we'll keep bringing you their stories.